Okay. Oh, we're just gonna let folks in, and it's about 12:59. So, oh, it just turned 1 p.m. So maybe I'll just wait 10 more seconds, and then we can get started. If you're coming with questions right off the bat, feel free to put them in the chat. We do have a list of questions that people submitted ahead of time, so we'll try to get to as many of those as possible, as well as any questions that come up as we're talking today. So let's just dive in since it's time. I am Dr. Sherry Pagoto. I'm a professor at University of Connecticut and director of the UConn Center for mHealth and Social Media. This is one installment of our webinar series that covers all kinds of topics relating to digital health and research methodology. I have here today, I'm very excited to have Dr. Danielle Jake-Schoffman, who is assistant professor at University of Florida, and Joe DeVito, who's a research coordinator here in the center, to talk about how we can improve retention in clinical trials research. So thanks for joining us, and let's just dive right in. I wanted to start off by just talking a little bit about why retention matters. I probably don't have to convince you all of why it's important, but in randomized trials, retention is of particular importance because participant loss really compromises the condition that was produced by your randomization, which is equivalent groups. So regardless of whether a participant provides follow-up data or not, they must be included in an intention to treat analysis, which is the appropriate primary analytic approach for the vast majority of clinical trials. And so the less missing data you have, the better in terms of the integrity of your trial. So we want to preserve that randomization, preserve as many participants as possible so that we can minimize missing data. And throughout, particularly behavioral interventions, there are all kinds of threats to retention. I have a list of them here. So the more burdensome your intervention is, lots of visits that can, have a negative impact on retention. If your population has specific barriers to whatever it is that you're asking them to do, for example, if it's an in-person intervention, transportation can be a barrier, time, competing priorities, things like that. But also factors like how well people are doing in the intervention. Sometimes they feel like, well, I'm not doing very well in this intervention, or I've lost interest in it, and so I should drop out of the study. So all of these are issues that we'll address and kind of ways to prevent them from leading to participant loss. So we structured today's webinar around the different phases of a trial when you want to think about retention. And so we'll start from the beginning when you're designing your trial. Maybe you're writing a grant right now, because I know NIH deadlines are coming up. When you're drafting your recruitment ads, your consent forms, so kind of that pre-IRB phase. Then you want to think about retention during recruitment, pre-enrollment, and onboarding. We'll talk about some things you can do during those phases to enhance retention. You want to think about retention during the intervention, during data collection, of course. Actually, never stop thinking about retention. So all through the course of from writing the grant to collecting that last follow-up data point, you want to have kind of retention on your mind and different procedures to kind of maximize your attention. So some things when you're designing the trial. So you're writing your grant, I'm writing one right now. So things that I want to think about right now are things like, what is the length of that assessment battery? If you're like me, you get really excited when you do a study and you think of 1,000 measures that you want to throw in there. And then you realize, oh my goodness, this measure battery is going to take 2 hours to complete. And then you start sifting them out because you're like, this is ridiculous. So you really want to think about keeping that assessment battery lean, because the more burden it is, the more people are going to give up on it. You also want to think about what are the barriers to participation in the intervention that I'm proposing in the target population I'm proposing it for. So, and this could be any population. They all have certain barriers. You might be working with older adults. You might be working with certain underrepresented minorities. You might be working with pregnant women. You might be working with students. They all have barriers. So if it's a student, they're away during summer, during different breaks. If you're working with Pregnant women, they have certain barriers to participation, or new moms, they have certain barriers to participation. So it's helpful to kind of think about what those barriers are as you're designing that intervention to make sure they're not so plentiful that it's just going to be hard for that group to participate in what you're proposing. Intervention intensity is another one. I know a lot of us are trying to kind of reduce the intensity of interventions, get things to be maybe more technology delivered to reduce that participant burden on the intervention end. You also want to think about, where am I asking my participants to go? So if this is, if it requires people coming to where you're located, what are the barriers to your particular facility? I know at UConn, we have a real walking campus. And so I sometimes cringe when we have people come in. When we need to ask people to come in to do assessments, because I know they have to navigate like the parking garage and then walk, maybe 10, 15 minutes to get to a certain building. And so you kind of want to think about that too. Is the facility that I'm using conducive? Or maybe there's another place that you can rent out that would be much easier for participants to reach. Because if they find it to be a hassle, or there's a cost or any burden to showing up, it's definitely going to be reflected in your retention numbers. For remote trials, maybe you go remote, I'm going to circumvent all that. You want to think about the barriers to the technology. Do they have Wi-Fi access? Do they know how to use the technology that you're using to collect your data or do your intervention? Obviously, participant incentives are something you need to think about when you're writing that grant, because that goes into the budget. So you want to make sure your incentive structure makes sense for what you're asking participants to do before you go ahead and submit that grant and have that budget sealed. The other thing to think about is, what is the best way to reach your population? Text, email, social media. We'll talk about different ways that you can reach folks. Sometimes if you have multiple points of contact, it increases your likelihood of catching your participants when you need to. And we have really good luck, for example, catching people on direct message over Facebook and text message. And Joe will talk a little bit about that. In many trials, we try to engage family members and caregivers, get contact information for them. So if we can't get in touch with the participant, we can get in touch with somebody that they know. I know in the WHI, I think in the DPP, Diabetes Prevention Program, and some of the larger trials have used things like that. We have in the past as well, with some good luck. One thing I definitely want to mention, which is my little yellow bubble in the corner there, is this is what pilot feasibility studies are all about, is where you can test out your retention procedures in advance. Sometimes we do pilots and we're like, oh, I'll just do a small study to see whether I get an effect on my primary outcome. No. Like for your pilot feasibility study, what you want to do is test out your retention, recruitment, and other procedures of your methodology. So you might feel like, oh, retention seems like an unexciting outcome for my R21 or my R34, but it's always my main outcome for my feasibility studies. Okay. Can you still see my screen? Because it kind of went out for me. Okay. Considerations when drafting participant-facing documents. So one thing that you really want to think about when you're drafting up recruitment ads, consent forms, and other documents that are for the participant is to make sure that they make sense to your participant population. They might make sense to you and seem very clear, but they may be less clear to the people that you've written them for. And so you want to think of like, how wordy are these? How cumbersome? How dense is the text? I wouldn't rely entirely on the consent form, because it's like all these pages. People are only going to remember certain pieces of it.
Sherry, your slides did disappear.
Yeah, and I don't know why. Okay. I'm not sure what happened there. Somebody asked to annotate and I said yes, and then the slides went away. Should I try to reshare? Okay. How is that? Can you see it now? Oh, wait, sorry. Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. I clicked to approve annotation and we lost my slide. Sorry about that. Are we back in action? Sorry about that. Okay. So I was talking about when you're drafting participant-facing documents, you want to make sure that you have a way of assessing the participant's understanding of those documents and of the study of the, in the documents that you're using. So I recommend, before you fire off your recruitment ad, your consent form, is actually do some cognitive testing to see how people are understanding what you've written. Other things that you might consider doing are finding lots of opportunities to remind participants what's being expected of them in the various participant-facing documents that you're drafting, branding your documents with logos and things like that that are recognizable and really professional looking so that people feel like that your study documents look very professional, but also kind of memorable if you've got like a little logo there. So I wanted to kind of comment on the curse of knowledge. So this is that cognitive bias that occurs when we communicate unknowingly in a way that sort of assumes that the people we're communicating to has a certain background to understand. And I love this little cartoon. So like when you're drafting your participant-facing documents, think about when you're using words like baseline or intervention or assessment. These are research words and they may mean something different to lay folks. And so I try to get rid of all of that language and run those documents past somebody who's a member of the target audience to kind of make sure they understand what it was that we wrote. Occasionally, we'll get feedback from a participant about a recruitment ad or, some participant-facing document that really shows like they kind of took it a very different way than we meant it. So that's where that cognitive testing can become, I think, very useful. So I have here a list of considerations for recruitment as they pertain to retention. I'll just point out a couple of these. I won't comment on every single one of them, but one of the things that we discovered when we use survey panels to recruit for randomized trials is that, like Qualtrics, for example, is that people who participate in those panels are typically expecting to do surveys, not necessarily interventions. And so you get a bit of a different type of sample that, in our experience, we've had somewhat lower retention rates, I think, because they sort of signed on to do surveys, not necessarily being like a 1 year longer intervention. So just something to think about a little bit. I think it's also important to kind of make sure your participants have kind of a concierge or like one point person that they can go to with study questions. If you have a lot of staff in the mix, like interventionists, screeners, baseline people, yada, 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 it may be confusing. And so if they have a question or want to reach out to someone, they may be like, I don't know who I'm supposed to talk to about this. And then they may not reach out at all. So you want to make sure that they have an easy way of communicating with you and getting a hold of whoever it is that they need to get a hold of about the study. I also want to comment on relationship building. I think this is kind of sort of the most important thing in some ways for retention. I remember we had several years ago, someone in our group had just a very, very high EQ. And whenever you met this person, like you felt like you knew her for 10 years and she was so good at retention because she just like made best friends, I think, with every study participant. And so whenever we couldn't find someone, we'd be like, "Go send Sue." She'd know what their participants like had babies and, all about their lives and things like that. So that relationship building, I think, is really, really important. I also think making sure that your team is very diverse and reflects the populations that you're targeting, that can certainly help for both recruitment and retention. And finally, one thing that we've discovered is that we don't want to overly chase people who aren't returning calls during that recruitment pre-randomization time. So if they're not really that into the study to begin with, they're probably not going to be there for the long haul either. And so we've kind of let people go who have, seemed lukewarm from the beginning and aren't returning our screening calls. Like maybe this is not a good time for them. So being super aggressive at recruitment, might bite you later on the retention. Also do a comment on incentives. Again, this is kind of a pre-randomization opportunity to stack the deck in your favor for retention. You want to make sure, obviously, that your incentives match the time commitment, erring on the side of the longest completion times. Sometimes I think we're trying to stretch our incentives as far as they can go, and then we might short people and not giving them like enough incentive for what time it takes them to do the assessment battery. You might even break up your incentives for different aspects of data collection. So I do a lot of obesity trials, and so we might have surveys, focus groups, and 24-hour recall interviews that go over the phone. And so if you break up the incentives for the different things, if you have a participant who doesn't want to put a lot of time into follow-up, maybe they'll do, one of those things and not the other. And that way, at least you can try to make your incentives match the effort that those different things require. Because doing a survey is less time than obviously a focus group or a recall interview. Another incentive thing that you can do is have them gradually increase over time to kind of sweeten the pot for those longer term follow-up points. You can even have like a bonus incentive at the end where, like, if you complete everything, you get an extra $20 or something like that. I'm going to turn things over to Danielle, who's going to talk about pre-enrollment procedures and what you can do at this stage in order to enhance retention.
Great, thanks, Sherry. So at this point, you've sort of recruited potential subjects and you're putting them through your baseline and screening procedures, kind of everything before enrollment and randomization. And so a lot of studies use some form of orientation session, some form of kind of informational session with participants ahead of randomization, but it's pretty inconsistent and the content really varies a lot across trials. These sessions kind of focus to date on communicating trial procedures, but there's a lot more that we could really be doing at this point. And so to that end, we could be better engaging participants in the research experience at a deeper level, including more explanation of the scientific rationale for a trial, and more detail and comprehensive understanding of trial procedures. And this may help to enhance retention, kind of regardless of individuals' personal experiences and their personal goal attainment, for example, their own weight loss goals and how well they do towards that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one method that we've used to enhance this part of our procedures, and we call it the method's motivational interviewing approach to orientation sessions. These orientation sessions in the past have been held as interactive, group-based, and in-person sessions, and they're held pre-randomization. And I'm going to talk a little bit about ways that we kind of the general methods that are part of this, and then ways that we've adapted these procedures for some of our trials, including remotely delivered interventions. So there are 4 key components to this approach, and we've described them in more detail in a recent publication that we'll link to as well. The first is to set clear expectations for participants. So we try to be really explicit about lengthy assessments, kind of acknowledging that sometimes it may seem, for example, like we ask participants the same question in 4 ways, and that might be kind of cumbersome to them. We do our best, as Sherry said, to reduce the burden of assessments, but being really upfront about that can be helpful. Then we actually explain some of the rationale, the scientific rationale for the methodological procedures we use. So for example, we dig into what is randomization. It's similar to flipping a coin. Why is that important for us to be able to test our questions rigorously? We also talk specifically about what the scientific impact of dropouts is on our conclusions. So for example, if everyone who gained weight in a weight loss intervention doesn't come back, we might think this program is really stellar and works for everybody. But in fact, we can't learn anything from those people who don't come back. And sometimes those are actually the folks who we can learn the most from. So kind of emphasizing that. Then comes the motivational interviewing kind of component where we have an explicit discussion about the pros and cons of participating in the trial and then being in either of the two conditions. So we explicitly, when it's in person, we have people break into small groups and have a discussion together and then report back to the broader group about the pros and cons they've brainstormed. I'll talk about how we've adapted that particular component. And another important part there is that the person delivering the orientation session tries to stay neutral about participation. So this is kind of the opposite of a hard sell. We're not trying to convince everyone of that orientation session that they should participate for sure. We're trying to help people explore if this is a good opportunity for them at that point. And then the fourth component is making explicit two commitments. So one is to yourself and your personal goals in the trial. The second is to being in the trial. So returning for assessments kind of regardless of how things are going for your personal goals. So descriptively, in the past, this approach has been associated with higher retention at 18-month follow-ups, so 96% and 93% respectively in two large weight loss trials. But since those original trials where this was actually delivered as part of the original procedures, there have been a number of adaptations. So some of the adaptations have been to remotely delivered interventions, where this has been delivered via webinar or via conference call, obesity prevention versus treatment. Currently, it's being implemented in a trial for folks in opioid maintenance treatment undergoing a physical activity intervention. It's been adapted for parent-child dyads, pregnant women, so many populations that are traditionally hard to retain and kind of reach effectively. And then as well, these different delivery methods. So in our recent paper, we are able to describe some of the first kind of quasi-experimental evidence for the impact of this orientation session. And what we had were 3 case studies that we describe where the studies began, they were implemented without the orientation session, and then there were signals in each of these 3 trials of either suboptimal or differential attendance or retention. So teams then implemented the orientation sessions, and we are able to analyze retention and attendance data from participants enrolled before and after the orientation sessions were implemented. So we were able to get kind of a clearer picture of the potential impact of this procedure. So here I'm going to talk about one of the case studies within one of Sherry's studies. And this is called the Get Social study. This was an adaptation of a diabetes prevention program weight loss intervention that here is tested either in person or via a Twitter-delivered group. And this is a 12-month intervention testing for non-inferiority between these 2 groups. So in this particular trial, oh, sorry, there's one more. So the target was 328 participants. In this particular trial, they were recruited and randomized within waves. And so we were able to use the waves, the structure, to implement a new procedure. So I'll talk about that in a second. So in this particular trial, data from waves 1 and 2 showed that there was some differential participation, and the retention at 6 months was a little lower than expected. And so there was a 12-month assessment. At this point, this was just really early data that was coming in, and we thought, this isn't exactly how we were hoping this is going to go. What can we do to course correct at this point? So in terms of the differential attendance, we found that for Get Social, which was the Twitter-delivered condition, there were 100% of people went to at least one session, but a third of people who were assigned to this in-person condition came to 0 sessions. So it seemed like there might be some sort of preference for a condition where people were actually not completely sold on being randomized potentially to either condition. And And then retention was about 80%, which is adequate retention in the literature. That's a bar that we often strive for, but as you'll see, we could do better. So I mentioned that these orientation sessions were originally delivered in these in-person group settings. And for this particular trial and the way that all the procedures were set up, that wasn't a feasible thing to implement. So we adapted the in-person sessions to a webinar delivery. And one of the main kind of components that we had to adjust and think through how to deliver was this motivational interviewing directed discussion of the two conditions and the pros and cons. So we were able to have this type of discussion via the web chat. And I think on the next slide here, we have an example. So, similar to the WebEx that we're all on right now, we would ask questions and then have folks chat into the chat box responses. And we got really good engagement here. We asked that people participate explicitly in this part of the webinar. And overall, most participants, I think, said at least something in these conversations. So it was definitely not quite as, it wasn't the same exact engagement as you would get in an in-person discussion, but it seemed to serve a lot of the same purpose. And interestingly, the kinds of things that people might bring up in these conversations that could kind of necessitate follow-up might be folks saying a concern like, I usually have childcare, or my mom could be a backup, but I'm not sure if that will always work. Or I'm planning to switch jobs soon. I may have trouble committing to the full trial. So if folks chatted something that kind of like put up our feelers in terms of, oh, this might be a problem potentially, our study staff would follow up with them via phone call the next day to just further explore whether it was in fact a concern at all. So usually we had maybe 1 or 2 phone calls, I think, to follow up after each webinar. Just to give you a quick idea of where we implemented this, we had a battery of other baseline assessments. You can see here after phone screening, we have a baseline visit, online questionnaires. We implemented it as part of that battery of different procedures. And this, again, is pre-randomization. So quickly to share a little bit of the results within this particular trial. I want to note that here, I mentioned there were 9 waves in the study. We presented data here on waves 1 through 6, and that's because the trial switched locations. So we wanted to make sure that the potential effects we were seeing here were due to more closely aligned to a population that had a similar experience. And so with waves 1 and 2, this was before the implementation. Waves 3 through 6 were after implementation. So overall, we had 275 people complete an orientation session. Only 5 ended up being screened out for an issue that arose during the webinar. Again, saying something in the chat that might raise our antenna wasn't an immediate exclusion. We would always follow up to have a discussion with the person, but the chat maybe helped to accelerate some of those discussions. We did have 22 people who were specifically excluded because they missed a webinar and they didn't contact us to schedule. So as Sherry mentioned, this kind of goes to that idea of maybe not trying to chase down people too hard. If we have procedures and they're mandatory and folks don't take initiative to follow through with them, then sometimes it's not the best fit to be an 18-month intervention or 12-month. And then I just wanted to note quickly that this procedure really was not, the purpose of the intent of it was not to be a weed out. And in practice, that's not how it worked as well. So in this study and across the 3 case studies that we present in our paper, we did some analyses to test a few sample characteristics before and after the implementation. And we found there were no statistical differences in the average age or BMI of samples, the percent of race and ethnicity represented, educational attainment, or the percent female. So in fact, we had really similar samples. It didn't systematically kind of discriminate or discourage any particular group against participation. So quickly, these are some of our results across the assessment. And so here for Get Social, you can see in the first four parts of the bar graph, descriptively, we had increases of almost 10% in retention at both 6 months and 12 months across the two conditions. We ran multi-level models to see if there were group by time differences, which there were not. And so in the far column, the highlighted column, you can see our adjusted model results showing that there was an over 10% increase in retention across conditions and across time points. So again, we implemented this because of a difference in attendance, and we also had over 10% increase in retention across groups and across the 12 months of assessments. And then across these attendance outcomes, we also had a statistically significant increase in participation in 0 sessions, such that less people across the two conditions participated in less sessions. So it corrected for that differential attendance that we were really concerned about. We did have some increases in attendance. Those were not statistically significant. So just to wrap up, we feel that we successfully were able to adapt this in-person webinar, the in-person sessions to our webinar delivery. And because of the format, once we had our slides set up, once we had a script and we were able to train across a couple of research staff people, this was really a low burden procedure to implement and something that we've now implemented within our teams across multiple other studies because of these impacts that we saw and the low burden to actually put this in practice. It may have helped to correct for our differential participation. It also helped us to increase overall retention. And I think one of the key things to highlight here is that we think that one of the ways that this may help the most, in addition to helping people truly consider if they're willing and able to participate in either of the two conditions, which seem to be key in this particular study, this helps to educate participants at a deeper level about procedures, including the long-term follow-up that's expected. And those that kind of education is something that we can draw on later in our difficult conversations that we may have to have with folks who may be considering dropping out or transitioning to assessment only. And so that's something that Joe will talk about next.
Great. Well, I'm excited to talk about it. So as Sherry sort of talked about at the beginning of this webinar, you want to consider what you can do to really increase your retention throughout every step of, planning a trial and implementing it. Danielle brought us through this, strategy of what to do as you're recruiting and screening people. And I have a lot of information about what to do during the intervention. Now, my experience is all Sherry, working on trials that deal with obesity, and typically they have, a social media component. So I'm a little bit limited there, but I do want to share what is, what's working to be very useful. So obviously, number one is keeping regular touch with the participants. And that just means sort of making them, at the very least, aware of what's coming next. So if there are 2 follow-ups, really giving that heads up of like, okay, the first follow-up period is coming. Because as Sherry mentioned, as much as you think everything you've told during the consent process and you think they have a very strong grip on the program, it's without fail that people are just completely unaware that there was a follow-up somehow. And you're like, okay, yep, there is one more follow-up that we'd like you to come in for. I know that some do holiday and birthday cards. We've never done that. Same thing with study swag, but it certainly is something you often hear when people talk about retention. So we figured we'd add it to this slide. One of the biggest things that we do is following up with participants who are starting to show signs of disengagement, and I'll talk about that more in a few slides. And then, as always, you got to make sure there's a way to sort of re-engage or catch participants up when they are starting to, miss visits or miss content. So for, reminders, really what they serve as is just, again, another barrier so that people aren't forgetting that there's a visit coming up, aren't forgetting that there's a regular group meeting to attend. So we send them calendar invites. We also send them, reminders. If there's weekly data collection, we're going to send them a reminder every single week. Hey, make sure tomorrow morning you step on your scale. So that there's very little chance that they'll forget. And when that does happen, if someone misses a meeting, if someone misses a weigh-in, we immediately follow up with them and we say, hey, let us know if something's going on. Are you having issues with your digital scale? Is there a reason you couldn't weigh in? And that sort of reinforces to them the importance of this data, that we're very serious. We let them into our trial and we expect to get the data that we set out to collect from them, and that we're not going to let even 1 week fly. We're going to set that example that we're going to chase them there. So just a note about digital weigh-ins. We can move on to the next slide. Really making sure that, to the extent possible, your data collection is, as low a lift as possible for your participants. As I mentioned, all of our trials have to do with obesity. We typically do digital weigh-ins. We use a Fitbit scale. We ship them to participants. We set up a call if need be to set it up with them. We're giving them, okay, here, create a Fitbit account just for this scale so that the study staff can log into it and we can see your weight. We can see the date and time of that weight so there's no confusion. We can see that the weight actually came from the scale. It wasn't manually entered. So those are all things that's perhaps a little bit more burden on the study staff, but it's so easy for participants. All they have to do is step on their scale and we take care of the rest. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we're going to pursue that missing data, and we always have a backup plan too. So if for some reason people have changed their password or their scale is no longer syncing in our survey software, we set up a survey for every week of the trial where we can send the participant a unique link and they're able to upload a screenshot securely to us. And then we can get their data that way. So that's just sort of a note because I will talk about weigh-ins a few more times. So just to give people who aren't familiar with our trials and these types of trials, this is what we talk about digital weigh-in. Another strategy that we mentioned was monitoring engagement or monitoring attendance. So, for each meeting or each week of the intervention, we're looking to say who's participating. So sometimes that's an automated process, like on Twitter. It's pretty easy to run, scripts and get, okay, when's the last like date from someone? When's their last tweet date? For something like Facebook or whatever other platform, it might be more of a manual process, but it's still worth it because at the first signs of, someone's starting to slip, we have a protocol in place for what we're going to do. And every week we would look at this report and say, okay, who do we need to check in with based on their engagement? And as I mentioned, we had a protocol in place. It is different trial to trial based on the length of the trial, the frequency of the visits, that sort of thing. Here's just an example. So typically, if this was, let's say, a Facebook delivered weight loss program, if there was a week where someone was quiet, we would have the counselor go ahead and tag them in the comment section of a post. So whether that was goal setting or whatever it was. If then another week went by and they hadn't engaged at all, we would have the counselor reach out to them via direct message to check in with them because they're probably still active on Facebook. They're just not participating in the group. If still no response after week 3, we'd go ahead and have the counselor text or call the participant or email, but we found text seemed to work a little bit better. And then finally, if it's been about a month now and they haven't engaged, that's when we go ahead and say, okay, the study staff is going to reach out. What's going on? Is there some sort of AE? And at that point, if we don't get a response, or if we do, and the person says, I'm just not that into the program anymore, we go ahead and move them to what we call follow-up only, sort of an internal thing. And a follow-up only status is very helpful, and I'd love to talk about it more. And pretty much the goal of moving someone to follow-up only is that we're saying, okay, we're pestering them at this point. We've reached out to them. They're pretty obviously not interested in getting back to us. Let's let them cool down for a little bit and then follow up with them once it's the assessment period. So we craft a little email and we say, hey, we don't want to bother you anymore, or maybe you let us know that you don't want to participate anymore. But we remind them of those commitments that they made during the webinar. So, we still intend to follow up with you at the 6 and 12-month mark of the study. It's really important that we're able to do so regardless of, how much weight you did or did not lose, regardless of how much you participated. It's very important that we're able to follow up with you. We always emphasize the compensation. You'll still be entitled to the $75 if you complete the follow-up visit. We always send them all of the materials that they miss. And then, of course, we say, you're welcome to re-engage at any time. And when we are ready to, schedule those assessment visits, again, I mentioned we send them kind of a modified email. And the phrase that I always use is, thanks again for agreeing to follow up with us, even though you're no longer participating in the program. Because it just is like, whether or not they verbally agreed with us, it's just them being like, oh yeah, I did agree that. Okay, I'll go in. So it's been very effective for us. And then again, actually scheduling the assessment. I mean, some of this is very common sense, but there is some strategy to it. So if we have to have someone come in and see us, we start sending those reminders really early, like probably a month early. And we send it from multiple channels. So it's coming from the study staff who they've been in regular contact with. It's also coming from their counselors, whether they're going, again, to regular meetings or they're in some sort of online program. Wherever they're paying attention to, those reminders are starting to go off. And then usually about 2 weeks ahead of our target date is when we start scheduling, and you have to have flexibility. We found, can I have 8 people come in on Thursday night? Is it possible for me to start them at 4 o'clock and go all the way to 8:30, knowing that those people are very likely to show up? Do you have to do a block on Saturday morning? And one thing that's been helpful is just, again, knowing your population. So if you know people are flaky, this is a good tip. If you know they're flaky, schedule them early on in the period so that when they inevitably miss their first appointment, their rescheduled appointment is still in that follow-up period. Online programs, obviously a little bit different. It's just really setting the expectations of what they are. Oh, there's going to be a survey, then we're going to have you weigh in on this particular date. We found that's really helpful, giving them a date to aim for if there is one piece of data collection that needs to happen. That's really helpful. And then again, focus groups are a whole nother thing, but being able to schedule many as possible, accommodating time zones, et cetera, are all things you need to be prepared for and have the staffing for ahead of time. And then how many times are we contacting them? So as many as it takes, really, and we're very careful with our contacts. So we typically have some sort of protocol in place where we do 3 emails, 3 text messages, 3 phone calls. Sometimes if they were really engaged in the program, but all of a sudden they're not responding to the follow-up, we might have their counselor or their interventionist reach out. And every contact that we have with them is an opportunity to remind them again of the points we made during that webinar. The importance of the data, the compensation, and another thing is, oftentimes we have these stragglers who maybe they've done their final weigh-in, but they haven't done their survey, and then they show up to the focus group. We're always prepared. We always have a rolling report that we can say, oh, okay, Marcia, thanks for completing the focus group today. Just a reminder, you still haven't completed your survey because you got them on the hook. So you got to be able to very quickly get that information to them. And then inevitably there's a handful of stragglers, and that's when you start negotiating with them. Okay, they're obviously not going to be able to commit to the time to come in for this thing or to join this focus group. Can you send them the email questions? Oh, they skipped items on this survey. Was that intentional, or is it because we can't mark them as, our IRB doesn't let them mark it as mandatory, and so was it just an accident? And most of the time we email them, say, hey, did you mean to skip these questions? Are you comfortable going back in and completing them? And they're like, oh yeah, no problem. Are they able to, again, send a picture or a screenshot of their weight if their scale's not connecting? And then again, you have to start making a deal and saying, okay, I know that you don't like the 24-hour dietary recall. If that's the reason you're not going to come in and see us, you don't have to do it. Please just come in and let us take your weight. And then finally, when all else fails, that's when we shift our focus to just the primary outcome. So what we do, and there's always a handful of people where we have Sherry reach out to them. So have the PI email them personally and say, please, 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 are you willing to provide a weight to us? Are you willing to just come in for a weigh-in? And just to give you a sense, we had a trial of about 130 people, and we had about 12 people who were completely non-responsive. And we said, okay, well, one last chance, let's have Sherry email them. And 8 of those people, 8 of the 12, agreed to provide their final weight. So that brought our weight data up to 97% complete, which was awesome. So you never know, and I don't know what the phenomenon is. Is it because it's from someone new? Is it because it's from the PI? I don't know what it is, but it seems to be effective. So we talk all the time how we can improve intention and improve participant experience in our trials. One thing we found is, okay, in the future, we're going to design our surveys. Sherry mentioned very low burden, only the important questions on them, but also can we start them with the easiest questions or the most important ones so that they don't open the survey and they're immediately smacked with this very burdensome questionnaire? Can we just get them in answering the easy one? Is there a compensation schedule where it incentivizes them providing complete data, like they'll get a bonus if they do everything? For those longer trials where there might be staff turnover, is there some sort of landing page that we can use to really have people be able to go, okay, that's where I go if I have a question. I'm going to go there and all the information's there that I need. And then we're going to start using automated appointment or call scheduling software, just because sometimes that's where you lose people in the back and forth between, oh, can I get you on the phone? Can I get you on the phone? Well, now we have a scheduled phone call that they were able to pick. So those are what we've used. They seem to help.
Okay. Can you hear me? Good. Okay. Thanks, Joe. And I will say all of the, procedures that Joe has described, and our lab has pretty much produced us over 90% retention rates in all of our trials. And so there's been a lot of trial and error over the years, and we've kind of settled in with the procedures that we're talking about here. Although they can always be improved, we always shoot for 100%. Occasionally we'll hit 100, not that often, but once in a while. Someone had asked in the questions about, is there evidence for retention strategies? We thought that was an excellent question. I love Danielle's study where, she and her co-authors were able to look at, using our data and other trial data, evidence for the webinar. And I am a total believer in that orientation webinar. I will never do a trial without it. But there's also a paper that came out in 2015 that suggested a suite of strategies that are associated with higher retention. And let me show you the strategies that they mention in this paper, and I would highly recommend this paper. So what they found is that using like 5 or 6 of these strategies tends to be associated with higher retention rates. And so I would agree with that, kind of, having a number of strategies that you're using at different points in time during the trial can be useful and important. And so some of the things that they're listing here are things that we've already talked about. And so I think good planning and, like I said, pilot testing your retention procedures in your pilot trials is a super important step. So just to kind of wrap it all up, but I want to make sure we have time to get to some questions. And so I just have my eye on the chat in case there are any that come through. But I also have some that came through in the beginning. I guess what we want to definitely leave you with is to think about retention at all stages of your trial, including right when you're writing that grant. Piloting those procedures, do cognitive testing of all participant-facing documents to make sure that they're interpreting them in the way that you mean for them to, and to so they can point to areas where you might be using words that they have a different definition of than you do. Building that relationship with participants, and educating your participants about clinical trials. And so that can be through the webinar, and it's also something you could even add to your website where you're recruiting people and say, what does it mean to participate in a clinical trial? What I love about the orientation webinar that Danielle talked about is it's really kind of giving people kind of clinical trial literacy. You want people to understand what they're getting themselves into. You want them to get excited about it. And it's kind of, fun to explain it to them. And I think they do get excited about it. Another kind of side benefit of the orientation webinar is that your study staff, who would typically facilitate the webinar, because they have to teach that clinical trial literacy, it really kind of hones their expertise as clinical trial experts as well. So, and finally, just, using multiple strategies, like we said. So let's turn over to questions that we received prior to the webinar. And yeah, like I said, if you have any, pop them into the chat. And Joe and Danielle, feel free to unmute and chime in where you can. One question that came up a lot was retention in children, adolescents, or families. And Danielle, I know you have some experience with this. So what are your thoughts about retaining children and adolescents, and would you do anything differently than the things that you've already recommended?
Sure. So I think, off the bat, one suggestion I have is to use if it's feasible, to try to use and adapt this orientation sessions procedure in trials with populations of varying ages. But I've used it successfully in a trial with parent-child dyads where the children were 9 to 12 years old. And so I adapted all the language to be accessible to children as well. And when I got to parts such as the kind of research 101 module, I connected it to concepts that they might be learning within their science classes. So we talked about what are experiments. For example, like building volcanoes. That was an example that a lot of kids brought up that they had tested in their science classes. So sort of trying similar techniques. Also engaging the parents kind of throughout that whole process as well. So I think that's kind of one of my main suggestions off the top.
Yeah. And what I'll add to that is when it comes to teenagers or young adults, actually any population this is going to be true for, kind of finding out from them in your pilot feasibility work, what is the best way to reach you? Because I know college students, for example, are not like other adults in that we're like on top of our emails 24/7. Whereas a college student, that may not be the best way to get a hold of them, or a teenager, they may not be as sort of into email as they might be other mechanisms. And so even social media accounts, or so finding out from your population, whether it's a racial ethnic minority of a certain age, gender, life stage, you name it, in that pilot feasibility work that you're doing, ask them questions about that. What would be the best way to get a hold of you? What would be the least annoying ways to get a hold of you? Because some people might say, I don't mind if you text me, but do not be filling my email inbox up. I'm just going to get aggravated by that. So really embedding this in the preliminary work that you're doing to get the answers to those questions, I think is a super, super important step, and kind of another reason why those pilot feasibility studies are so important. Somebody else had asked about ethics and retention. Like, how does ethics play into it? Are there any sort of issues around representativeness? And I was glad that Danielle had presented the data about the fact that the orientation webinar did not change the nature of the sample. And that you underscored, Danielle, that this is not a weed out. It's not a run-in or anything like that. It's more educational. It's about clinical trial literacy. So from an ethical standpoint, I don't think there are issues there. Where there can be issues from an ethical or representative sample standpoint, I would say that lives more in your eligibility criteria. So if you're having eligibility criteria that's getting rid of people who might have issues associated with low adherence to your intervention, that's going to affect the representativeness of your sample. And so you want to, when it comes to representativeness, I think that is entirely in your inclusion exclusion criteria. And, if you're doing more of an effectiveness or implementation type of study, you want to really be mindful of not being overly exclusive in those criteria. Let's see other questions here.
Sure. I want to jump in here with one I see from Michelle about whether there are any problems with IRB around the MMI approach and pressure of coercion of participants. So thank you for that question. I think it's a really great one to consider. And actually, so I think two important things. One is that the goal of the orientation is not to convince anyone to participate. It's actually kind of the opposite. So I know that in traditional motivational interviewing, you're really trying to coach someone into picking behavior changes that are salient with them. And here we're using elements of motivational interviewing to help diffuse ambivalence, but we're definitely not trying to convince anyone to participate. So I think that's a really important distinction. And the other piece is that we separate the orientation from the consent process. So we have people undergo the orientation, have these discussions, and then have a pause where they consider on their own if participation is a good fit for them. And so it's not as though we kind of rush them through all this information, then we have them consent on the spot. It's separate from the orientation. And so I think that really helps to kind of eliminate the element of potential coercion.
And I see there's another question about IRB, and I would get IRB approval for all of your retention procedures, including, the question was specifically around birthday and holiday cards. We did have a trial a few years ago where we did that. So any contact that you have with the participants, you definitely want to run past your IRB, including the language and that sort of thing. And that's why it's a good idea to have like a strong retention plan from the beginning. So I was involved, as an advisor on a trial, and they kind of brought me in at the point when they were doing their follow-up data collection, and they said, "Oh, we've only getting about 50% follow-up. What is your advice?" And I thought, at this point, it's tough because it's so late in the game and nothing's IRB approved. Like all the things I would suggest, would need IRB approval. And so we're in a bad spot with 50%, and we're already knee deep in chasing people around. So like having that strong plan that's IRB approved in the beginning is going to prevent you from having to be like, "Oh no, let's get an amendment to do this. Let's get an amendment to do that." And then it sort of slows things down. I see another question about the time gap between webinar and consent. Thoughts about that, Danielle?
Yeah. It sounds like, you're kind of, it looks like here approaching participants before delivery, but consenting after delivery. So yes, I think it would make a lot of sense if you're able to provide the orientation ahead of delivery as well. So you're sort of like lining people up with all the information they might need to make a decision about whether they want to enroll. And it sounds like you may have a particular, window of opportunity, so to speak, to enroll participants. So potentially ahead of delivery would be a great time to deliver this.
Great. I see another question on our list of questions around waitlist or delayed control groups. So this is where you have a control group that they're not going to get anything intervention-wise, maybe for a few months or longer. And then you're worrying probably like, "Oh no, I'm going to lose these people." I would keep in touch with them. And Joe, I'd be curious what you'd say to this too, at different time points to kind of stay in the mix. Like this is an opportunity to send them like some study swag, or just have like regular, emails maybe once a month saying, "Hi, just a reminder, we're going to get you all started on September 15th or whatever the date is," so that you're sort of still in the kind of their orbit, and don't get too far off their radar. I think the longer the span between the participant hearing from you, the more likely you may lose some. So definitely stay in touch. Anything you'd add to that, Joe?
Yeah, just making it super clear to them that there is going to be that waiting period, and are they okay with it? And if, that they have other options available to them if they want to do something right now. Because we've had that in our studies where we had to delay or we were waiting on IRB approval. So we had to reach out to people and say like, oh, okay, oh, the study's been postponed, or study postponed a year by COVID, and sort of letting these people know, like, we're so happy to have you back into it in a year if you want to, but we also understand, that you may not want to wait that long. Just exactly that, regular communication. And I think ours was about every check in with.
And kind of related to that, one thing I'll say about remote trials, because we sort of moved to remote trials a few years ago, there is this opportunity where you could only engage with people electronically, but I would avoid that. I have found that in trials where there is a phone call, where you're actually talking to people, you get higher retention rates than if you're only engaging through electronic, email and that sort of thing. And I think it's easier to kind of do that relationship building over the phone too. And so we do not leave out that sort of phone screening interview and just convert it all to, oh, fill this out. Here's a link. Because I think that warm touch of a conversation and being able to introduce yourself, like, hi, I'm Sherry, and let me tell you about the study, and that sort of thing can really, really help. So I see that we're out of time, but if you have other questions, feel free to send them along to us over email. We can still try to answer them or shoot us a tweet. But we'll have this, we've recorded this, and so if you missed part of it or you want to listen to it again or share it, the recording should be up in, Joe, how long does it take for us to get the recording?
Pretty quickly, probably just a few minutes.
Oh, okay. That was fast. Okay. Well, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. We've got another webinar coming up next month. Joe, what's the topic of next month's webinar?
So it is about GIS for social media.
Right. That's right.
October 28th.
Right. If you're interested in GIS and social media, check us out on our next webinar. But in the meantime, have a great day, and